CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode of our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Bhekinkosi Moyo, the Director of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment. I'm really excited this afternoon to be joined by Shelagh Gastrow, currently a consultant in philanthropy, higher education, and the advancement and sustainability sector. Shelagh, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
Same here. I wanted to have this conversation. 13 years at the helm of Inyathelo. You established it in 2002. Can you give us the factors and maybe the genesis as to why Inyathelo was such a needed institution?
I'm going to go back a little bit before that, where the spark went off in my head as such.
Right.
I worked with Mampela Rampele at the University of Cape Town. She had a huge capital campaign she wanted to launch, which was going to be her legacy. And I think she saw her legacy as the physical part of UCT. And in that, I mean, she built a completely new library, new student centers, new computer labs, everything that would bring UCT up to modern facilities. But it cost money. And for the first time, she decided to set up a proper development office at the university. And one day I got a call from her and she said, I'd like you to apply for one of the jobs. And I thought, well, why not? It sounds interesting. Yeah. I wasn't absolutely sure exactly what it was about because the concept of a development office was fairly fudgy. But we soon learned very quickly that we had an incredible target to meet and 15 months to meet it because we had a matching grant from the Kresge Foundation. And so the group of us actually had to get together and make sense of what is fundraising. And for those 15 months, we chased money. We wrote proposals, we ran around meeting people, and at the end of it, we achieved the goal, we achieved the amount of money that was required. But at the end of it, people were cross, they were tired, people resigned. It was just like not a pleasant place to be in after that kind of pressure. Right. And I asked myself, fundraising is not fun in that respect. Is there not some way you can turn it on its head so that you attract money rather than chase money?
Yeah. And
started to develop this concept of advancement. Now, the concept of advancement is used internationally, but we put quite a different spin on it because we focused on attracting resources rather than fundraising.
Right.
It doesn't mean you can't fundraise. There's certain technical things that still have to be put in place. But how do you attract resources to the organization? And we started to implement that at UCT. And then other universities were coming and saying, well, can you help? And in the end, the Kresge Foundation supported us in setting up a program that would help universities adapt to this advancement model. But I'll go back a little bit because when I said I was leaving, some of the donors to UCT said, well, where are you going? And I said, we're going to start this thing. And the Atlantic Philanthropies who were funding UCT at that time said to me, we'll back you, but we will only give you a matching grant. So you've got to practice what you preach.
Yes, so look for money.
Yeah, no. Well,
or attract money.
And essentially, we were two people and an admin person. And in order to bring those funds in, we had to start. We had no record. No one really knew who we were. But we got going and we met those targets based on using our own philosophy. And actually those targets helped us to establish what became a very large reserve because we were not relying on that matching grant so much. We were actually raising the resources we need for the programs. So there were lots of lessons on the way and we learned. And one of the first things I had to learn was how do I take what's in my head and put it into a training program because a lot of it's intuitive, you've kind of figured it out for yourself. And suddenly you realize you've got to pass this on. And that was, a big learning curve. How do you do this? When I look back at my first PowerPoints, for example, they're thoroughly embarrassing. I would never show them to anyone.
Or even your first proposal for that matter.
Anyway, but slowly it grew. And then people from the non-profit sector came and said, well, there was a new generation of black leaders in the non-profit sector. And they came to see us and said, they can do all the program deliveries and those kind of things, but the area they don't have a lot of skills in was finding the resources.
Yeah.
And so we started working with non-profits. And it grew. But one of the things we did when we started Inyathelo, and in our founding document, there were 3 key pillars of work. And the one was university, one was civil society, and the third was to grow philanthropic movement in South Africa.
Yeah.
And then we started getting going with that.
So those 3, if we took one at a time, 13 years later when you left, where would you say they were? I know in the university space there was lots of movement there. In terms of growing the philanthropist sector, I took part in some of the events that you were leading on. I think the third one was the non-profit. Yeah. So if we took one pillar and just do some kind of a reflection on that.
Probably the pillar that I found most interesting was the non-profit sector.
Yeah.
So we ran quite a few conferences where non-profits came together, and we looked at a range of issues, the context that they were working in, a lot of peer learning, that kind of stuff. But people used to come to the office because they wanted information on fundraising. And one day a woman came to me and she said, do you remember me? I came to you 2 years ago. And I said, no, I don't remember you, but I remember the organization.
Yeah.
And she said, well, I thought I'd come back and tell you what happened after our discussion. So they used to just they'd come and sit in my office. We used to make a joke and say, this is Psycho 101, they're the tissues.
Yeah.
Because there was a lot of stress among leaders in the sector. And she said to me, after our meeting, I went home and I looked at my notes and I realized I had a plan. And she said within 6 months, we'd raised 7 million rand.
Wow.
And then a little bell went off my head, and I said to my assistant, how many of these meetings have I had this year?
Yeah.
She counted. She went through the diary, said they're over 50. And I said to her, that can't just keep being random. It's actually already a program.
It's a record. It's a program.
Yeah, and we're not recording anything. We don't know the impact of these meetings, or whether we should be doing any kind of aftercare or what's happened. So we developed what we called a non-profit clinic, and that formalized, and we had people trained up in it, so I didn't have to do all the interventions. I tended to do those with my own peers, other CEOs, for example.
Yeah.
And I think it's still going.
Yeah.
So that was one of the
fascinating,
most interesting things.
Fascinating, because what you are saying is almost artworkly. You were creating a database,
yes,
but you're also creating some form of records and impact.
Yeah.
And so if you were to follow up on each and every one of them, in fact, maybe let me ask, did you follow up on each and every one of those 50?
We did have some evaluations done,
Yeah.
And what I think when I say to people I've worked with hundreds of organizations, it's probably right.
Yeah.
Many of them are still on the ground because of the work we did. And also I think the ongoing support, because something comes up and you've done your first steps, but now you want support for the next.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that happened.
And then in the education sector, I mean, I'm interested in it because, as you know, and we will talk about this, we have gone into that space now where we're providing academic training on fundraising, advancement. And one of the things that struck me a couple of months back, we were sitting for interviews for one of the fundraisers for the Development and Fundraising Office at my university. And the requirement by universities is that you must have a degree to apply for a job. And most of the people who qualified from a practical point of view actually did not have degrees. The best fundraisers we came across did not have degrees. And so the university was in a conundrum. It wants a degree, but the person that it wants does not have a degree. And so it really said to me and to the people there that we need to do something more, but something also different, because if we want to develop that field, something has to be done, but rather differently. And I know that, again, that's a whole journey on its own with Kresge and others that you embarked on, with the attempt to create, certificates at Rhodes, and all the way to the creation of advancement offices in different universities. And I think at some point, I don't know that they're still doing it, there was also the production of a report that you were publishing every year on higher education.
Yeah, so we started off, the Kresge program was very interesting. We developed it with them, and it was a carrot and stick kind of program. Firstly, it was competitive to get into this advancement program because the universities were desperate to set up professional advancement operations. It was competitive. We could only cope with 4 or 5 at a time. And then we literally nursed them for 5 years. They had certain benchmarks that they had to meet. And if they met them, then they got an additional grant.
Yeah.
So, and that was undesignated money from Kresge to use as they wanted. So there was a drive for the extra grant, but also what it did is it's, I suppose, pushed them beyond where they would normally have gone in meeting certain benchmarks. So it wasn't a case of, oh, we only met 2 out of 3. You had to have done all 5. They weren't necessarily killer benchmarks, especially in the beginning. Because, in the beginning, you had to structure. And it was one of the things that I think I really added to, because I was one of the few people who'd structured a development office up to that point. And I know some of the systems that we put in place still exist at different universities.
Yeah.
So that was the mechanism we used. And then Kresge came in for a second round of another 5 institutions. But everything else that we offered was open to everyone. So we would have a Vice-Chancellor's retreat every year.
Yeah.
And people came from other countries in Africa as well. We did training for other African universities. Like we helped set up the office at the University of Jos. And that was the first one in Nigeria. So from then, it's kind of repeated itself throughout Nigeria. So that little catalyst that we provided spread. And we had people from Kenya, Ghana, coming to Cape Town for their training. So it became this huge network of universities. I think what's happened with universities, vice-chancellors have moved on.
Yeah.
New staff, has come in. And I did a lot of coaching of vice-chancellors themselves. So, for example, I traveled with Loyiso Nonka from Wits to the US to kind of on his first big fundraising trip, and sort of critiqued it and discussed each meeting, how it could have been done better. Sometimes when he stumbled a bit, I would just intervene to keep the thing going. Yeah. But he became a really good fundraiser. And sometimes you just need someone to come along and have a discussion after each meeting about how it went and what went well, what didn't, how you can improve, etc. Yeah.
And in hindsight, if you look today backwards, you look at what universities are expected to do now. So the government subsidies have decreased substantially. School fees has also decreased as a result of COVID and other economic downturns. And so universities are now thrust into the act of fundraising.
Yeah.
Vice-chancellors are under pressure now. And, academics, all right through universities, we're seeing this massive push for fundraising. For some universities, they are using the special moments, like Wits, we're using the 100-year period and others. So in hindsight, this was a very necessary intervention. But I'm not so sure that at the time, most universities saw and actually took the advantage of building the systems and putting them in place so that when this moment came, they would just be able to activate it.
I think there were systems in place. Right. New vice-chancellors often thought they had to cut a budget somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's where they got sliced.
Yeah.
Because the commitment to Kresge was they would continue to sustain these, but a lot didn't.
Yeah.
Even UCT, after we had built that up into incredibly successful office, literally crashed it. It was a decision made at the highest level. Everyone was fired. Everyone had to reapply for their jobs, and it just became a shadow of what it had been.
Yeah.
So it's often the easy cut for a vice chancellor.
Yeah.
But you're right. In the end, it's the goose that lays the golden egg, and it's a crazy thing to knock it out. And we have an article in the review this year where the Vice Chancellor Wits says they need training. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I've been there. I had to run workshops with every faculty.
But to his defense, I think he wasn't there.
No, he wasn't there, but this is what happens. We're talking about a long time ago.
Yes.
So I understand, and I think there's a lot of space to rework that.
Yeah.
I've done some very interesting work with Free State University, and I did a very nice 2-day full workshop at Rhodes.
Yeah.
Where we not only looked just at fundraising, but generally third stream income.
Right.
And that was another area we worked in, not hugely, but we ran a very big conference on third stream income. Yeah.
Great. So I think we might find our way back into this, but I want to talk a bit about the growing philanthropy pillar, which I also think you did incredibly well as Inyathelo, but also as an individual, because you continue in that space. So again, from Inyathelo perspective, I know that there were several programs that you were engaged in. One of them was the idea of going out into communities and identifying projects that would probably be recognized. And so the whole idea of awards and write-ups on specific individual stories came into being. And I think that's probably one of the first times that I interfaced with Inyathelo, because I was one of the people that came to assist with judging. But again, that was probably just the tip of an iceberg for somebody like me who just saw that part. But you were deep in it as the person driving it. What were some of the
I consciously felt we were totally over-reliant on international funding, and that it's necessary to build a local philanthropic movement in the country. And, I don't come from that background with money and, the ability to give lots away.
Yeah.
So we had to find ways where we could enter that space. But it wasn't only wealthy individuals we were looking at, but also to show that giving and philanthropy exists across the board.
Yeah.
So the first thing we thought of was to heighten awareness around philanthropy, and that's why we had the Inyathelo Philanthropy Awards. And it's interesting for me thinking back, because we couldn't get a funder.
Yeah.
Even one of the banks said they would fund us, and they pulled out a week before the awards because they got nervous. This wasn't going to work out.
Yeah.
And but actually the awards took off. People were proud to have an award.
Right.
And we presented the whole scope of philanthropy. So there'd be wealthy individuals who'd set up foundations. And we sent people out into the communities, and we found people who really did classical philanthropy, real altruistic philanthropy, where you'd find a woman who had been a nurse and retired, and she'd taken her pension money to set up a project in the village from which she had come.
Yeah.
And that project had thrived and now was feeding everybody, and kids were going to school, and et cetera, et cetera. So it had all these knock-on effects. And it was those that were of particular interest. But we had it both, because high-end individuals were a huge attraction in the press and to get people into the room. But the other ones kind of moved people in the room far more. And I think in some ways, if that had continued, we had a real mass of people, we could have built quite a lot of social cohesion around the issue.
Yeah.
So I think after I left, they did it for 2 more years, and then it stopped.
Right. Yeah.
So that was one leg of that pillar. The other thing we started to look at is, how do we bring philanthropists together? And we ran a conference in 2010, which Atlantic and Ford and Mott funded, I think, where we brought together international private philanthropy and local. And what was fascinating for me is they had never communicated with each other. So you would have forward giving money in South Africa, local foundations, no engagement whatsoever. We didn't bring in corporate social investment because we felt it's not technically philanthropy. It's, it has other reasons for being. And at that conference, it was a long 3-day conference, the resolution at the end was Inyathelo was asked to set up a network. And I can't tell you, it was really difficult. So we started with 9 local foundations. And they sat in a room, they wouldn't share what they were doing. They kind of felt everything was fine as it was. But for some odd reason, they kept on coming back. And so it grew and it became what was known as the Private Philanthropy Circle. And again, we had a symposium. This symposium today is an extension of what we did then. And we had quite a lot of peer learning, a lot of face-to-face stuff. And so in 2015, the group was big enough to actually now stand on its own 2 legs, and we set up IPASA. And I actually, for my talk today, I went back to the IPASA constitution to say to myself, is this review meeting the needs? And I just smiled because there was a big stamp on the top, and I had signed off, founder member of IPASA.
So now you understand when I said even the reason why we are here today.
I'd forgotten about that, but there it was. It was quite funny. Yeah, so, and then I left Inyathelo, and Amanda Block and I served as the secretariat for 3 years until Louise took over.
So fascinating journey, and at some point, Sheila, I know you might have this as part of your plans. We will need a biography of some sort.
I know, people keep asking me.
We will need a biography of some sort, because a lot of things that you're saying here, you and a few other people know them very, very well. But they would serve so well, especially for some of the new upcoming people who are either setting up institutions or actually finding themselves in positions where they have to do exactly what you did. So they don't have to reinvent the wheel. So in all these 3 pillars that you have described, I could just see, even a toolkit on each of them.
I've done toolkits. I actually did one for SCAT recently for community-based organizations, which is quite different from, bigger NGOs. Been doing that stuff.
Great.
But it's, I think the thinking behind it all, the philosophy behind it is unusual. And I think that's what I've always felt I achieved a lot. It's not the same. If I'm doing, let's say, work with the university or a non-profit, and they ask me, come and do a fundraising workshop, my first question is, what's your purpose? And I'm always amazed that they don't know. Even a university will say, well, our purpose is teaching and research. And I say, no, that's how you do something. Why are you doing the teaching and the research? What is the purpose?
What is the purpose?
And then there's a huge debate, and I always say to them that you'll have to have another strategy session because you haven't sorted it out yet. Because without purpose, how do you grant make? How do you raise money? How do you even strategize without purpose? And I have I've really don't deal with visions and missions. Because they're corporate. Corporates don't have to explain their purpose. We all know what it is. Make money. So the vision and mission is more, we're going to be the biggest producer of electronic cars or something. But in the social sector, purpose, you have to understand your purpose. It's not to make money. It's not the antithesis. It's much better, much more important.
Okay, so of course, 2015, you decide to leave Inyathelo. At that point, did you feel you had achieved what you had set to do?
I felt I couldn't take it any further.
Or the environment had changed to an extent that you needed something new?
No, I felt I had taken Inyathelo as far as I could go. From then on, it would have been more of the same. And I felt it needed a fresh leader who would have an imagination that could take it further.
Yeah. So if I'm to ask you now, looking back, do you think you should have stayed?
For the sake of Inyathelo, I should have stayed because it's basically, I don't know where it is now. I think there have been 4 CEOs since I left.
Right.
And there's some interesting questions I ask myself because I left them with a massive reserve. I think there was 50-something million and they owned their own property.
And a building,
Yeah, and I thought to myself, if there hadn't been such big reserves, maybe more effort would have been made to keep the thing going. You know, it's very easy.
It's fascinating to you say that because I actually had a conversation with Bongi. Kabele is coming out soon. And also one of the things that we discussed was how obsessed she was raising the money for the children's fund. Like she lived, slept, and dreamt resource mobilization. She left. We still have to have a conversation around the state of the finances at the children's fund now. I'm aware that the new CEO of the children's hospital is busy fundraising because again issues of the economic environment has affected that. But I think leaders like yourself who had a vision set to do the work because of the passion but also the purpose. When you leave, it's because you feel you cannot add anything new. But when you actually look back, you realize, wait a minute, there are certain things that maybe I should have done differently. So in your case, what could you have done differently?
You know, when I left, I thought this would be a shoo-in for anyone. We had staff who knew what they were doing. There was money there. There were donors in line for the next 2 or 3 years. And that all the person had to do was sit and watch for a year and then decide. And I was not in control of that process. And the fact that it was destroyed so quickly, I've often asked myself, was it a lack of succession planning? You know, what could have changed? And I honestly don't know. But for me, if I had to look at my personal legacy, people kept saying to me, but Inyathelo is your legacy. And they didn't understand Inyathelo is not the legacy. Exactly.
It's an instrument.
The legacy is universities that have thrived and organizations that have thrived and the growth of philanthropy. And for me, IPASA, when I look at it, and I keep thinking, that catalyst from the beginning and the support along the way has produced something which I think is probably quite enduring now. So whether Inyathelo shuts down, there's still a lot of money there, can go to more useful purpose, or whether they manage to resurrect it. I'm not really worried about that.
I'm happy to hear that because look at us at Vest now. We're running a program on the postgraduate diploma on resource mobilization. And that program came from your work from Inyathelo. And so even if anything happened to the instrument, we now have already, I think, 10 students who have graduated already with that diploma. So those 10.
No, so I'm not tied to it, and I don't see myself as in its image, or it in my image, and that's why I was happy to go. I remember that feeling, you know, when you see on TV or whatever, when someone leaves, they take their little box off their desk. It was exactly like that, and I got to the lift, and I went. It's done.
It's done. You achieved what you wanted to do. So, but I also want to, we can then maybe segue to another conversation, but maybe before we do that, what you entered into the space at the time when philanthropy in Africa was not that popular. It was practiced, but it wasn't that popular. We did not have most of these things. So these symposia and others, they were non-existent. So you were almost like lone rangers, so to speak. There were others doing something closer, but you were really like the people that set up some of these conversations, some of the processes, and begin shining a spotlight on what eventually now has become an attractive field. Today, philanthropy is a very attractive field, but then it wasn't.
No.
So what were some of the challenges and barriers that you were faced with, and how did you mitigate against them?
The first thing was the word philanthropy.
Yeah.
which people felt was elitist. It didn't belong in Africa.
Yeah.
And we played with lots of words. We played with Ubuntu. We tried reconceptualizing it. And in the end, we just decided we're going to use it and give it currency.
Yeah.
Although it has Greek origins.
Yeah.
And so I didn't feel as though it's strange for everybody, the word philanthropy.
Yeah.
But I just remember once listening to, after a number of years, listening on the radio to a talk show where youngsters were talking about, well, my philanthropy is this and my philanthropy is that. And I thought, well, there it goes,
It's popular these days. If you go to LinkedIn, you see every young person says, I'm a philanthropist.
And we put it out there. It was just, we're going to use this word. Because we really struggled. So,
and from a leadership point of view, were there any challenges or barriers that you faced in this space?
The leadership issue goes back further. That's why I said you'll find out how old I am. In 1983, I was thinking to myself, I was at home with children, so I was not fully employed. And we were in the start of what was going to become a very complex, intense political situation in South Africa. And I realized that people in South Africa did not know who the black leadership was, because most of them were either banned, underground, in jail, or out of the country. And I thought to myself, I've got the contacts, I know quite a few, so why don't I do a book called Who's Who in South African Politics, which stretched right across the political spectrum, from the far white right to very radical left. And I brought out 5 editions of that book, which were nearly all based on personal interviews with people. So the interviews were done underground. I had to go to Lusaka, I had to sneak around Harare and all sorts of odd places in South Africa, but also interviewed, apartheid cabinet ministers and whatever. And that gave me, I suppose, the confidence not to be scared of people. And I think it probably produced leadership in me as such. Because from then, because I'd met people at every level, had gained access. I mean, obviously people checked me out. You couldn't just get in. But somehow or other, people were okay. And I could really connect. People were just a step away. And I think that gave me enormous confidence to be able to do what I did after that. So I think leadership is something that grows when there are opportunities for it, but you also have to seize them.
And so that takes me to probably one of the questions that I always ask, which is, who is Sheila? I don't know how far back you want to go, but there are certain elements that seem to have influenced the kind of a person that you became and the kind of a leader, but also a go-getter of some sort. So who is Sheila?
I must say, when I look back, I'm also quite shocked at what was achieved. Because you're just doing it, and I'm very intuitive. I'll feel something. I'll think, okay, like for instance, that non-profit clinic. It wasn't something we sat in our strategy sessions and worked out, what are you going to do here and there. The light goes off. And I tend to be very intuitive, but then I will act on that intuition. And that did drive people crazy in the office sometimes. I mean, I had a program director who said, if you come in here again and say, I've got an idea, I don't want to hear it. Because the ideas led to other ideas, and I'm still a bit like that.
But what are the foundations? So let's go back.
What makes me want to go back to that is, I don't think, people ask me, what kind of leadership do we need in the world in order to sustain organizations, sustain universities, etc.? And I talk about social leadership.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you go onto the web, you'll find stuff on social leadership as well, which much to my shock was, I couldn't believe it when I actually looked it up, how much I'd been thinking the same. Because leadership of an organization or an institution has to face outward.
Yeah.
You don't want to get bogged down in the who can take the computer home on the weekend.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not leadership.
Yeah.
You need to have efficient program and operations people who do well at that.
Yeah.
I don't. I hate bureaucracy.
Yeah.
I mean, when I train people, I always say beware of bureaucracy, because bureaucracy means death.
Right. Right.
You get so tied up in the systems, you can no longer be flexible.
Can't think.
You can't think. Everything's got to take time. Meantime, the time has passed, and they become terribly rules-based. And Hannah Arendt has this wonderful quote about bureaucracy, the rule of nobody. It just becomes rules. So I always say to them, face out.
Yeah.
Because everything you need to sustain your organizations out there, it's not just the donors and the money, it's the partnerships.
Yeah.
It's the media.
Yeah.
It's your researchers out there that you need to be able to understand what you're doing. Why partnerships for me are so important is they become this invisible network that holds you when there's trouble.
Yeah.
If your relationships are good. But if you're not outward facing and you're busy printing the t-shirts all the time inside, none of that comes to you. And an organization is only as strong as its external environment.
Right.
So for me, that was always natural.
Yeah.
That was the part of my work that I loved the most.
So, but is that inherited? Is that taught? Do you look back in your childhood and maybe see it in your parents, in your grandparents?
Probably my mother.
Right.
Yeah. She was, she went to university when she was 16.
Wow.
And she always made things happen. And she was a girl from quite a poor family in Zimbabwe. Yeah.
Wow. At 16?
Yeah.
My goodness.
So when she said jump, everyone just jumped. I often think, and I have one daughter in particular who reminds me of my mum, and everybody says she reminds them of me. So there's probably an element there that I don't actually see.
Yeah.
But I think you do learn a lot of that at home.
Right, at home, yeah.
I went to boarding school, so I think you learn a lot of self-reliance. There's no one there to pick you up.
Yeah.
You just got to get going. But I do think that capacity to just freely engage with anyone has been the
so
most important.
So the other thing that I forgot to ask, but maybe it also ties in nicely here. When you were asked to come and set up this advancement office at UCT, what is it that made you take that? Were you already trained in fundraising?
No.
Or
I'd done a bit because I used to work for IDASA.
Okay, yeah.
And that's another chapter of my life. I ran what they call the Africa program. So when you talk about Eritrea and that, been there all over the place.
All over the place, yeah.
Yeah, and again, that was a case of, you're going to run this Africa program, and it was 1992, and I said, but I haven't, our passports aren't even valid. I have a South African passport. I can't even go to Ethiopia. And they said, find a way.
Wow.
And so I ran those programs for 4 years of taking pre-94 South African decision makers to other parts of the continent to learn from the post-colonial experience. And you just got to go.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things. I don't know. Just do it.
If I had time, I would want to talk to you about that, because I interviewed, I just said his name now, it just disappeared. Not Alex Borain, his partner, the ones that set up IDASA together.
He set it up with Vansel Slabbert, but he's
yes. I interviewed Vansel Slabbert before he passed.
Did you?
Yes, I
know both of them very well.
I interviewed him for my PhD. So he was telling me the story about their fundraising efforts in the Scandinavia, but also in the US, and told me a beautiful story about how they were given the name of George Soros to go and fundraise from him. If we had time, I would want to talk more about that.
I stayed at Torre Island often. I knew them very well.
Yeah, so it was a beautiful story about how you should be prepared about how much you are asking for before you go to the donor, because in his words, they got there They talked about almost everything. They didn't ask for the money. And on their way out, he then asked them, so why were you here? And they said, we're here to ask for money. He said, how much? And they didn't have the figure.
Oh. Well, I'll tell you a funny
Yeah.
one about the Inyathelo. You've been to their offices?
Yes, yes.
So I was in New York, and Chris Oxley from the Atlantic Philanthropies was there, and I phoned. I said, can I come and see you? And he said, you've got 10 minutes. And I was leaving that evening to come back to South Africa to get to the other side of New York, where their offices were not in where everybody else's were. And I got there, and he said, right, you've got 10 minutes. What do you want? I said, a building. He said, how much? And I told him. He said, okay. And that was it. And my husband said to me when I got home, he said, you have such a cheek.
Wow. And so that was it. That's how the building came about.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about that building,
Yeah,
to
that's
say
how it
one
came
of your
about.
legacies is actually the building, which has become, or ought to have become, a resource for
Yes.
the non-profit sector.
Yeah. It's
And-
got the most
yeah.
amazing resource
Yes,
center.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
No, that's how it happened.
Wow.
So
Fascinating.
I just remember my husband being horrified that
Yeah.
we had both though. He
Yeah.
was direct and I was direct.
Right, right.
So
Wow. And then you move from Inyathelo to consulting
Yeah.
with the Gastrow Philanthropist
Yeah.
now. And you've been writing a lot on philanthropy, but also been part of this new review on philanthropy in South Africa. We are into the 4th edition and we are launching that today. You are probably the best person to reflect on philanthropy in South Africa, historically, but also today. And some of it will come out maybe in the launch. But I just wanted to take the opportunity to have your thoughts on where philanthropy is, and using your different heads, be in a position to potentially give us some of the takeaway points in terms of what is currently happening, but also what to look for, especially if we cast our eyes into the horizons.
yeah, I think for me, what I'm pleased to see is a growth in young black people getting involved in philanthropy. Sia Kulisi, who we saw last year, and I think his wife is here again
Yeah.
this year.
Yeah.
To see that kind of thing getting going, Trevor Noah has
Yeah.
set up a
Yeah.
foundation. I think there's an awareness among emerging black elites, particularly, to formalize
Yeah.
philanthropy.
Yeah.
What frustrates me the most is we don't know the scope of it. It's very much under wraps,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
people also aren't keen to come out with it. But I do think it's the way it's got to go. I mean, you've got the old foundations that were set up during the apartheid period,
Yeah.
and they play a critical role. And they've certainly, in many ways, transformed quite a lot. But I think if we're looking at where it's going, we need to be encouraging a lot more of new black wealth
Yeah.
to get into that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm aware of what the issues are around first generation wealth. In fact, when I was at UCT, and now we're talking 20-something
Yeah.
years ago, I did a research project among the alumni and their giving.
Yeah.
And over, people were saying, I'm the first generation, the demands on me to give to the extended family, to give to the village
Yeah,
where I come
yeah,
from,
yeah.
I'm paying and I'm paying and I'm paying and I'm paying. And to the thought of putting up
Yeah.
a foundation is... So for some, it can be growing businesses. I think Tabang Squambani, for
Yeah,
example, is
yeah,
a good example. Where it emerged out of his business.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of old philanthropy that works like that,
Yeah.
where actually the family owns the business. So if the business is doing philanthropy, it's actually the family.
Yeah.
It's not like, shareholders are all going to be sitting there complaining the money's not coming to
Yeah.
them. So I do think that's where I would see growth. And I just hope that this economy can grow,
Yeah.
because at the moment
Yeah.
that's not looking
Yeah.
too
Yeah.
hot.
Yeah. Yeah. And then in terms of the themes that have emerged over the last 4 years, in terms of the editions, and you've been the chief editor. And so if there's anyone who's got a pulse right now on
Yeah.
South African philanthropy, it's you.
I think there's quite a lot on how it's done.
Yeah.
In other words, looking at how you bring environment into your giving. So, you know, if you're doing early childhood development, you don't have to become an environmental funder, but you can certainly start looking at ECD through an environmental lens.
Yeah.
So, for example, you could fund solar water heaters. You could fund, what are those, biogas digesters for energy.
Yeah.
You could check that nobody's using single-use plastic in the early childhood development centers. So there are ways of dealing with environment that you can add to your existing giving. I understand.
Yeah.
I mean, people have a mandate. The founders say you've got to do ECD. That's what you've got to do.
Yeah.
But there are ways of bringing in environment, and I think philanthropy has to think far more widely about that. And the IPASA toolkits are huge help for that. I'm seeing changes in the way people are funding operational money. I think that was something we hammered on endlessly, and I think it's started to sink in that you can't run an organization without operational cover.
Yeah.
And that 10% is, for me, I kept saying to people, who invented 10%? It's like, what is it? I think there's still quite a lot of, data-based decision-making going on. But I always have a critique about data, because the work is not what's in the data.
Yeah.
So if I have to say, what's my input, what's my output, my impact, etc., all that's fine. But most of the time, what am I doing?
Yeah.
I'm navigating the terrain to enable this to happen.
Yeah.
I'm having to meet with communities. I have to reassure people. You have to build trust. You've got to bring in partners. That doesn't fit in those columns.
Into those columns, yeah.
And it's the bulk of the work.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how you can measure all that stuff.
Right.
But it is, most of your time is spent doing that and not the programmatic
That's true.
stuff.
And then back on the 10%, just slightly, at that point, maybe we did not even have this coin termed now, which is decolonizing philanthropy. And now it's a big issue.
Yeah.
And because it's not just about the 10%, but it's about all the systems and mechanisms that philanthropy or donors utilize, which when you look at it from, colonial perspectives, you realize there were so many elements of it that were so repressive, so controlling, but also restrictive. And so now we've got this whole new debate.
I must tell you, what I've been spending a lot of time thinking about is the impact of the big international donors on local thinking.
Yeah.
Because local thinking in many ways was far more accessible. People could send a proposal, they could go and see a donor, there'd be a conversation. The rules and regulations weren't so tight.
Yeah.
But the influence of big philanthropy to create trends, which means everybody kind of gets on board or are seen as not being effective philanthropists if they haven't done it. The bean counting that went on. I really found it just cuts people out. If you can't produce a report to the quality that they want, cuts people out. So now there is this move to what they call trust-based philanthropy, which is part of that decolonization. But I started to think, well, what are these big foundations? Because are they philanthropy? Because philanthropy, I'll go back to the beginning, is about altruism. And the people who are running the foundations are not the donors.
No.
They are the employees who are suddenly making decisions. And I'm starting to think, no, you are grant makers. But don't call yourself a philanthropist.
Because the philanthropist is the person behind the money.
And now you're a grant maker. Give a bit. Relax a bit, and find a way to engage. So the trust-based philanthropy, I don't know if they're all going to pull it off because there's so many business interests that have got their clutches into this money.
Right.
That I always found quite offensive. And I must say, I have fought back often and told donors, take your money.
Right.
Because you can't dictate how I'm going to do something.
We had a conversation earlier with the representative Jesse Lisa from the Charis Jeron Foundation about their experience with the trust-based philanthropy approaches. And quite to their surprise, there's a bit of a pushback from communities who still think that they should still be asked to report, even though the foundation has said no reporting on our grants and everything. The communities are saying, oh, but you are denying us the opportunity to reflect on our work now. So I think it's still
I'm not suggesting one shouldn't report.
Yeah.
And nor should one not learn from what's happened. I think that's a bit too much trust.
Yeah.
I do think you should report because people are going to get burnt otherwise.
Yeah.
But it's how you report.
Yeah.
And also, what if you are altruistic donor, you'll go and see.
Yeah.
I mean, you can walk into an organization, you'll know if it's well run or not. I used to say to donors, you don't need a report. You can walk in. Is it neat and tidy?
Yeah.
Is the toilet clean?
Yeah. That's the report on
itself. That's what you know.
Yeah. That's the report on itself.
You don't have to go and put in, and we had 50 workshops and 73 people came, etc.
Yeah.
You can see it's well run.
Right.
And when it's not like that, then I'll have questions.
Yeah.
But over and over, I could, I remember once going into a big law NGO, and I was horrified by the entrance because they just had broken plastic chairs, a table with a whole lot of magazines. They were 20 years old, and this is where their clients were sitting.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's not respectful. That's why we made Inyathelo so nice. It was a sign of respect to the people we work with. Why should they have shabby? For me, it was just not respectful.
Yeah.
And I would never have funded them if I'd had my way. I would have told them, you do a cleanup.
So Sheila, I think you and I agree that there's definitely a lot that we have not covered.
Yes.
Whether we take the story of Inyathelo, we take the life after Inyathelo, and the Sheila from now going into the future, there is still a lot, and I would definitely appreciate if time allows, and God willing, to do another episode with you, where possibly we could just take maybe a focused view on one of your key moments. I still think that the story of Inyathelo is an important one for us to tell it in different ways. So there's this podcast, but there's also maybe a case study or even a memoir of some sort, because this is one institution that kind of revolutionized the way in which we saw philanthropy and started thinking about different possibilities, whether it's in the education sector, the non-profit sector. I mean, I still have memories of Mavis Matabata's story, which I came to know of, where, and there she was also, getting a prize from you guys. And there are so many of those. And so I would really want a situation where we actually bring this story to life. And like you said, Inyathelo itself is an instrument, but what was the impact? What is the impact of that? And so to end this, I want us to come back to that story and what influenced the naming?
Oh, the name of Inyathelo.
Yes. What influenced
it means
the
a step forward.
Yeah.
And that's what we wanted. Advance.
Right.
Was advancement. Yeah.
So it's
a stamp almost. A cash.
So we ended there, Sheila. The next time we'll take more steps and measure again where we are. Thank you for joining me, and I really enjoyed this conversation.
I enjoyed it too.
Right. So that was Shelagh Gastrow, currently a consultant in philanthropy, advancement, sustainability, and higher education. Thank you for watching this episode. See you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.